Oh, yeah, you have assignment. Shanta, remember you have assignment? Okay. All right, Shara, you look at it, right? And I'm gonna, what's happening?
Okay, no problem.
All right, so we're gonna continue with JSON today and Ajax. All right, so I do have some. We look at W3 schools, and then I do have some short points that I put in a PDF along with some exercises for you to do. So JSON. So anybody ever heard about JSON? You all ever heard about JSON? You know what JSON is? Okay then. All right, so what JSON stands for is JavaScript Object Notation. So it's a text format for storing and transporting data. So JSON is self-describing and is very easy to understand. So this is how you actually are able to send data from one place to another. If you have a database, normally we would transform the data in the database to JSON, a JSON format. So when it reaches the browser, we could simply extract the data, right? So this is an example of a JSON string. So you see here, you have open curly brackets, you have a name and the value. So it's key value pairs. So the key is name and the value is John. You have age, 30, and car null. It looks very similar to our Java objects, right? When we create our objects. So it defines an object with three properties, name, age, and car. Each property has a value. And so if you pass the JSON string with a JavaScript program, you can access the data as an object. So if I have this here and I extract object.name, I'm going to get John because I am referring to the key, which is name, and I'm able to get the value here. Similarly with age. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a lightweight data interchange format. It's plain text written in JavaScript object notation and is used to send data between computers. It is an independent language. So this JSON syntax is derived from JavaScript object notation, but the JSON format is text only. So code for reading and generating JSON exists in many programming languages. Right? Again, it was for a format originally specified by Douglas. So why use JSON? The JSON format is syntactically similar to the code for creating JavaScript objects. Because of this, a JavaScript program can easily convert JSON data into JavaScript objects. And since the format is text only, JSON data can easily be sent between computers and used by any programming language. JavaScript has a built-in function for converting JSON strings into JavaScript objects. That is the JSON.pass function. And it also has a built-in function for converting an object into a JSON string using JSON.stringify. Right, so you can receive pure text from a server and use it as a JavaScript object. You can send a JavaScript object to a server in pure text format, and you can work with data as JavaScript objects with no complicated parsing and translating. So storing data. So when storing data, the data has to be of a certain format. And regardless of where you choose to store it, text is always one of the legal formats. So JSON makes it possible to store JavaScript objects as text. All right, so the JSON syntax is a subset of JavaScript syntax. All right, it's derived from the JavaScript object notation. Data is in a name value pair. Data is separated by commas, curly braces hold the objects, and square bracket holds arrays. So when we say a name value pair, JSON data is in a name value pair, aka key value pairs. So a name value pair consists of a field name in double quotes, followed by a colon, followed by the value. So here you have the name, in our case, would be the name, colon John, and John would be the value. So this is the key, name, and John would be the value. JSON names require double quotes, right? So you always need to put double quotes for JSON names. So the names here, the first argument must be in double quotes. The JSON format is almost identical again to JavaScript objects. In JSON, keys must be strings written in double quotes. All right, so the key is the first item in our JSON structure, right, separated by a colon and the value. Keys can be separated. Keys can be strings, numbers, or identifier names. Right, so this is how it looks in JavaScript, where you just have name, colon, John. But in JSON, we must enclose our name or key in double quotes. Right, so in JSON, values must be one of the following data types. So your value, meaning what comes after the colon, must be either a string, a number, object, an array, a boolean, or null. JavaScript values can be all of the above, plus any other valid JavaScript expressions, including a function, a date, undefined. So in JSON, string values must be written within double quotes. All right, so you have to put that double quote. In JavaScript, your string values can be double or single quotes. All right, so we know that JavaScript could take both the single quotes or the double quote, but JSON, you must have double quotes. So because JSON syntax is derived from JavaScript object notation, you have very little extra software is needed to work with JSON within JavaScript. So with JavaScript, you can create an object and assign data to it like this. So you can have a normal variable here. We have some data. So we have name, John, age 31, city, New York. And you can access a JavaScript object like just simply saying person.name, and you will be able to get it done. So if we try this, and say person, right, my object.name. So constant is my object here. This my object has name, age, and city. And when I say my object.name, I'm able to get John. See if I could the age, right? So if I do age, I could get the 30, and if I do city, I'll be able to access the city, which is New York. Right, so because this is JavaScript, we are able to access it by simply using the dot notation. All right, so that's how you get the JavaScript. It can also be accessed like this. So if you want, you could use the dot name, or you could actually specify the name of the key. So in our case, when we say name, or we could say age, all right, so it's going to get the age. So two ways of getting access to your JavaScript object. Data can be modified. All right, so this is JavaScript objects, right? So it's looking at JavaScript objects, how we know here, because it didn't put it in double quotes. This is JavaScript. So we can access it like this. Data can be modified by simply assigning, or it could be, you could use the square brackets, right? So there are two ways of accessing and getting our data from a JavaScript object. We could say to use the dot notation, and the dot notation would be followed by the name or the key. And then you could use the square brackets again. You would put the key or name in the square brackets. As if I want to change it, I could change it here. Right, so here I'm actually able to, I'm changing it to Gilbert. Initially it was John. So I could change it by doing that, or I could have changed it by saying dot name at 2 ways. Right? Okay. So now we will learn how to convert a JavaScript object into JSON, right? So JavaScript arrays as JSON. right? So the same way JavaScript objects can be written as JSON, JavaScript arrays can also be written as JSON. You would learn more about this, about objects and arrays later in this turn. All right, so a JSON file, a file type of JSON file is .json. So it will normally end in a .json. The mem type of JSON text is application/JSON. So JSON versus XML, you may not have seen XML, but we used to have an XML class, right? So XML, both JSON and XML can be used to receive data from a web server. So this is how the JSON would look, right? So here we have an employee object here, and we have first name, last name for 3 employees. XML will look something like this, right? So XML will normally create our own markup, what do you call it? Tags, sorry, you'll create your own tags. So here we create employee first name, and again, we're putting John and the Anna on their last name, right? So JSON is like XML because both JSON and XML are self-describing, meaning human readable. So if you see this, you could understand what it means. You see employee, so you assume this is employee and you have first name, last name. So you're saying, okay, this is somebody's first name and this is somebody's last name. Both JSON and XML can be parsed and used by lots of programming languages. Both JSON and XML can be fetched with an XML HTTP request, right? So JSON is unlike XML. So you see the similarities between it because it's self-describing. It has hierarchical, so values within values. It can be parsed and be used by many programming languages, and it can be fetched using XML HTTP requests. So JSON is unlike, so this is the difference. JSON does not use end tags. So here you're seeing that you have a first name and a last of end first name. Right? So JSON does not use those end tags. So if you say first name, just put first name and then you put the value and then last name, and you don't have any tags, meaning these angle brackets. JSON is shorter, as you can see. It's quicker to read and write, and you can use arrays. So the biggest difference is XML has to be parsed with an XML parser. JSON can be parsed by a standard JavaScript function, right? So why JSON is better than XML? XML is much more difficult to parse than JSON, and JSON is passed into a ready-to-use JavaScript object. So for AJAX applications, JSON is faster and easier than XML. So when you're using XML fetch and XML document, you use the XML DOM to loop through the document and extract the values and store the variables. When you use JSON, all you have to do is fetch your JSON string, put JSON.parse, the JSON string, and that's the end of that. All right, so this here is just a difference between JSON and XML. So you're just seeing here. So these are 2 formats in which you can send your data. And this is just showing you how JSON is much easier. So JSON is the more popular, maybe 95% more popular than XML. XML is going out, right? So we will stick to our JSON. So JSON has some data types, so the valid data types. So this is the value. So when you have your key and your value, your name and your value must fall into one of these. It must be a number, a string, an object, an array, a boolean, or null, right? It cannot be a function, a date, or undefined. Strings in JSON must be written in double quotes. Okay, so we understand that we have strings. It must be, so John here is for the value. Remember, these here are for the values. The values must be one of the following, right? So here, and all our keys will be in quotes, right? Our name will be in quotes. This is our key. Key, value, name, value. Right, numbers in JSON must be an integer floating point. So you could only have an integer floating point number. Your objects, right? So valid JSON can be objects, and how we do it as objects, we would normally enclose it here. So employee here. And then you have your colon, so meaning the name of the object is employee, and this is the data. So you have name, value, John, age, value, to city, value, New York. So values in JSON can be arrays. So arrays we know will have square brackets here, square brackets. This one here is object, because this is how we do objects in JavaScript, but the only difference is, again, you have to put those quotes. Boolean, so you could have a Boolean value and it could also be null, right? So these are different data types that the values could take. Right. So how do you pass JSON? So a common use of JSON is to exchange data to and from a web server. So you have a web server which has data and you want to get that data into your browser or your client side, you would be able to do that via JSON. So it's a way of exchanging data. Right? So when receiving data from a web server, the data is always a string, right? We know also when we have data in a form, or if we input data in a form instead of our text areas or text fields, it always comes up as a string. So pass the data with JSON.pass and the data becomes a JavaScript object. So you're changing that string into the JavaScript object by simply using this method called pass. So imagine you receive a text from a web server, right? So this here is a web text from a web server. Again, it is it's a string format. You could use the JavaScript function JSON.pass to convert the text into a JavaScript object. So once you do that, you pass this. It looks like it's fine, right? But you notice it is a string. I just see in those codes there. It looks, oh, that looks normal. But it is not. It's a string, and we need to make it into a JavaScript object. So by saying JSON.pass, we are able to do that. So make sure the text in the JSON format is in JSON format, or else you would get a syntax error. Right, so when it says JSON format, it has to have name, value, pairs, name, value, pairs, name, value, pairs. Okay, so use the JavaScript object in your page. So if we look at this example here, we have a text, again, which is of a text, a string. We're taking this string and we're converting it in, we're passing it into a JavaScript object. And now we have a JavaScript object. We are now able to extract the name, let's say, and the age. Because right now, this is just simply a string. And if I had to try and access the name, I would have to do a lot of programming. I may have to go and read all of the string, then decide which one, maybe read this first, followed by a colon. When I find the colon, I'll have to then say that's the value and all of that, right? So that's a lot of work. So that string is able to be converted into a JavaScript object by saying JSON.pass. And once we have access and once we have that JavaScript object, it's easy for us to extract data by simply calling the object and then the name. All right, so that's what pass does. So arrays as JSON. So when using the JSON.pass on a JSON derived from an array, the method will return the JavaScript array instead of JavaScript object. Right. So when using JSON.pass on a JSON derived from an array, so if it's from an array, when you use the pass method, you will get a JavaScript array. So if we get here, we'll get this array. So we have this array. Again, this is a string because it is an array. Notice you're not seeing any key value here. It is not our JSON, right? It doesn't have name and John. Right, so this is a normal array. And if you use the pass, you will be able to access it as an array. So you could convert an array to an array in JavaScript, right? Again, this is a string. All of this is a string. So you convert the string array into the JavaScript array, and then you're able to access it. So when you're accessing data from an array, you normally use the square brackets, right? So square brackets is for array. Okay, so there's something called exceptions, right? So we know exceptions is anything that could go wrong. So date objects are not allowed in JSON. Date objects are not allowed in JSON. If you need to include a date, you have to write it as a string. You can convert it back into a date object later. So here we have a text where we have birth and we have 1986, 12, 14. So now if I want now, I'll have to pass it because again, this is a string. All right, so I'm converting the entire string into an object here. When I get that object dot birth again, because I have this is now our JavaScript class, we can now access this particular field by saying the name of it dot birth. So when we say object dot birth, we will get this 1986, 12, 14, and then we create a date object and we simply reassign it. So when I say new date object dot birth, so object dot birth here is going to take up this here 1986, 12, and it's going to make it into a date, and then you're going to assign it to the birth. So if I were to print it, right, so remember the date object has lots of properties where we could extract maybe the day, the month, the year, the time, everything, right? So that's why we would want to have a date object so we could get specific, right? So we are taking the data from the object. It's not a date, it's a normal string, and then we convert it into a date. So then we could extract and maybe manipulate it better as a date. Or you can use the second parameter of the JSON.parse function called revere. The revere parameter is a function that checks each property before returning the value. Okay, so converting a string into a data using the revere function. So here you have so your normal text, you're passing it, and then you have a function key value. If key is equal to birth, return new date value, else return value. So here this function, I haven't seen the function. You see the function? Right, so you're passing, this is another way. So far we have only been passing one argument to the pass method. Only one argument, which is this is normally the string. But here you can pass a function, and this function now would check the values, right? So if key is equal to birth, you're looking for the birth, and then once it is, you're going to then convert it to a date. Which seems to be a little longer. I think this other one easier. You just get the data and then convert it to a date like this. But in all this method and stuff might be a little longer for me. Okay, so functions are not allowed in JSON, right? So dates are not allowed in JSON. So these are all the exceptions. So we have some data types that we can use, right? So our data types that we can use would be a string, a number, object, array, a Boolean, and null. Some of it we can't use. One it will be a date, and now we're looking at a function. So functions are not allowed in JSON. If you need to include a function, write it as a string, and you can convert it back into a function later. So here I have, again, my text. I have a function. So my function in age is going to return 30. And so I have a function inside this text. So when I pass it, I could then say, I want to get the age, object.age, but remember the age does not, the value is not a simple string or numeric or float or Boolean, etc., right? It is a function. So here, when we get the function, we are going to use eval object.name. So when I say object.name, but this object.name is going to refer to the entire function. So I'm taking this function here and then I'm going to evaluate it, and then I'm going to put it and store it in the age field. So here we just have a function. So my age, again, this is our for our JSON JavaScript format and the object. And here we have key, name, and value. So this is the value, but our value could take on functions in JavaScript, but we can't do it in our JSON. So if we want this to be evaluated, what we have to do is get the function. We get the function by referring to the name of where it is stored, object.name, a return function. Then I'm going to pass this method called eval, which is then going to evaluate it, meaning it's going to actually execute the function. Think about evaluation. Evaluation means then you're going to execute the function and then you would be storing the value into that age. Right, so you should avoid using function in JSON. The function will lose their scope and you will not have to use the eval to convert them back. And you would have to use the eval to convert them back into functions, right? So they're saying avoid this, right? You can do it, but it's best you avoid. All right, so another one, popular one is JSON.stringify. So a common use of JSON is to exchange data to and from a server, right? So again, that's what JSON does. You just exchange data. When sending data to a web server, the data has to be a string. So we understand that. Sending the data, it has to be a string. And to convert a JavaScript object into a string, you could use JSON.stringify. So we know that the data has to be sent to the web server as a string. So if you have a JavaScript object and you want to send it to the web server, it must be of type string. So this method called JSON.stringify allows you to do that. So stringifying a JavaScript object. So imagine you have an object in JavaScript. So here you have our normal object, again, name, age, city. Right, we know this is JavaScript because we don't have any quotes here and it's not JSON. So you could use this JavaScript function JSON.stringify to convert it to a string. So here constant my JSON equals JSON.stringify object. So now this entire thing will be converted to a string. So the result will be a string followed by a JSON, following the JSON notation. So the JSON notation again will be key, name, value, key value pairs. Right, so here you have an example. Right, you have a normal object you created in JavaScript, and then you stringify it. So you're taking this object and then you're converting it to a string. And this is what our string would look like. So this is actually string. This is an object. So you took the object, JavaScript object, stringify it, meaning it made it a string, and then you would be able to, let's say, print or even send across to the server. And because again, data that goes to the server must be of type string. That's what the stringify does. All right, how you stringify array? So it's also possible to stringify JavaScript arrays. Imagine you have this array in JavaScript, John, Peter, Sally, and then you need to convert your JavaScript function into a string. You simply use JSON.stringify array. So the result will be a string followed by a JSON notation. So my JSON is now a string and ready to be sent to the server. And so this again is how we send in this data to the server, which must be of type string. So using stringify. So when storing data, the data has to be a certain format. And regardless of where you choose to store it, text is always one of the legal formats. So JSON makes it possible to store JavaScript objects as text. Right? So JSON makes it possible to store your JavaScript objects as text. Storing data in local storage. So if you want to store data here, so this is our JavaScript, we stringified, make it into an object, and now we could send it to across somewhere as text. When you retrieve it, you get in the item, you're going to pass it again, and then you're going to change it or convert it into a JavaScript object. Right, so you send the data, JavaScript object, you send it, stringify it so that it could go across and be stored. Now, when you're going to retrieve it, it will come back as a string. You're going to pass it for it to be returned as a JavaScript object. All right, so how do you could stringify date and JSON? The date objects are not allowed. Remember, it's not allowed. So the stringify function will convert any date into strings. All right, so it will convert this into strings. So if you actually do that, you would get the string version of today, which is the 10th, which is the 4th, sorry. All right, so remember it doesn't accept functions or dates, right? It does not affect the date objects. You can convert a string back into the edge object by the receiver. So meaning whenever you convert it, you send it across. So when the person gets it or the different program gets it, it can convert it back into a date object. All right, so again, JSON and JSON functions are not allowed as object values. So the stringify function will remove any function from the JavaScript object, both the key and the value. And so we have age and we have this function. So it will remove it. It didn't do anything with it, it just simply remove it. Right, so that stringify will remove any functions from an object, right? Because JSON does not accept objects and not allowed as object values. Functions are not allowed as object values. So this here is our value here, it's not allowed. If this can be omitted by converting your function into strings before running it. So running the stringify. Let's see. So it would not remove the function if you put it as a string. So you get it here. So this is the object. You send it the age as a toString method. So this will convert it as string. Then when you stringify, you will still get your function, but notice it is enclosed in double quotes. So it is a string and it is not a function. Right, so if you send your function using JSON, it will lose its scope. This is a JSON string, right? Inside a JSON string, there's a JSON object literal. JSON object literals are surrounded by curly brackets. There's a literal curly bracket. Keys and values are separated by colon. And keys must be string and values must be a valid JSON data type, which is listed here. And so all the keys must be. Each key value pair separated by a comma. It is a common mistake to apply a JSON object literal as a JSON object. JSON cannot be an object. JSON is a string format, right? So it is not an object, it is a string format. The data is only JSON when it is in string format. When it is converted to a JavaScript variable, it becomes a JavaScript object. Right, so you can create a JavaScript object from a JSON object literal. Right, so you're creating an object from the JavaScript, from the JSON literal. Normally, you can create a JavaScript object by passing a JSON string. So you can also create it by passing a string. All right, so this here is our JSON, the string, or you could pass it and make it object. So you can access object values by using the dot notation, right? So if you have object and they want to get the value, so if you have age and you want to get the value, remember this is name, value, key value pairs. So use the dot notation. You can also access objects by using our brackets, right? Using brackets, curve and square. Right, so remember there are two ways. We could use the dot notation or we could use the square. Right, so here you can look through properties using the for loop. So if I have here you have name, age, and car. I'm passing it over JSON. I'm passing it. So it becomes an object. So here we pass it. And now I could access everything inside my object. All right, so this text plus X is simply taking each value, name, sorry, each name, then age, then the car, and then it's simply printing it out. All right, you have a for loop, right? See how it. Right, so again, this is a JSON string. Inside the JSON string, there's a JSON array literal. Arrays in JSON are almost the same as arrays in JavaScript. In JSON, every array values must be of a type string, number, object, array, boolean, or null. In JavaScript, array values can be all of the above plus a JavaScript expression, including functions, data, and undefined. So you can create a JavaScript array from a literal. Yeah. You can create a JavaScript array by passing a JSON string. All right, so if we were to, let me see if I could okay, I won't be able to access it. Because you could sometimes find the you could see what type it is, right? Which you looked at last. And you can access it by using square brackets. All right, you can look through the array, we know how to do that, etc. All right, so JSON server. So a common use of JSON is to exchange data. You'll see this over and over again because it just trying to make it stick. That's what the use of JSON is to exchange data to and from a web server. When receiving data from a web server, it must always be a string, and you can pass the data with JSON.pass, and the data becomes a JavaScript object. So if you have data stored in a JavaScript object, you can convert it into an object, convert the object into JSON, and send it to the server. So you could do that by here. This is the JavaScript object. We could stringify it, and this will convert this here into our JSON, and then we could send it. So demo JSON.php. This is the script that is handling the data, right? That's what that does. Receiving data. If you receive data in JSON format, you can easily convert it to a JavaScript object. So here you're receiving it as in a JSON format. You know that because again, you see in the double quotes. When you pass it, you can convert it into the object, and now you have access to it. You can request JSON from the server by using an AJAX request. As long as the response from the server is written in JSON format, you can pass a string into a JavaScript object. I say, understand why we keep doing it in JavaScript objects, because once you pass it as a JavaScript object, you could then extract the data very easily by using the dot notation, or you could use the square brackets with the name as being the index. So using the HTML, HTTP request to get data from a server. So here, you're using the special function that gets data from the server, and on load, the function is going to pass the response text, and then let's see what is happening. Right, let's see if you understand this script. So you have a script, this is JavaScript, right? You have a constant new XML HTTP request. So this is a special method that allows you to get data, right? So on load, so this here, meaning when the page loads, we are calling this function, and the function is creating a constant, which is going to be some data that they're getting it, and we're passing it. And then we're going to simply echo or print the name here, because this becomes the object. Once you pass it, it becomes the object. It converting it into an object, and then you can extract the value. All right, XML.open get JSON demo text. So it means you're going to go and get this text, JSON demo text, and then you're going to send. All right, so let's look at our Ajax, and we'll see a little more. Okay, look at the JSON.text, right? So this here is our JSON.text. So here we have data. This is JSON format again. Name, John, age, and then we have a third name value pair, but the value is an array. So we were able to get this data from, right? So we get in the data, we access in the name. So we get John. Remember, we have seen any John here, right? But when you go here, the name is John. So you're getting the data from somewhere. You all following me so far, right?
Yes, yes.
All right, so let's look at Ajax. Right. So we look at JSON, which allows us to send data, right? So what is Ajax? So Ajax is a developer's dream, because you can read data from a web server after the page has been loaded. After the page has loaded. So you can update the web page without reloading the page. So, normally when we getting data from somewhere, or we need to extract data, we need to do some processing, we have to reload the page. But here, with Ajax, you don't have to reload the page, and it can send a data into the web server in the background. Meaning things could be happening in the foreground, and in the background, you could be sending data. So again, it doesn't really slow down your performance. So here, let's look at this. Again, you have a button on click, load doc, change content. So this method called load doc, what are we doing? We are going to get this XML HTTP request. This method on load, we're going to get the inner element, and then we get this dot response text. You open, you get the info from the Ajax info.text, and then you send. Let's see if we could find out. Just I don't have the file. I just wanted you to see what is inside the file. All right, so we're explaining here. So HTML page contains a div section and a button. We know that. We have a div, H2, and a button. The button calls a function if it is clicked. So when on click the button, you're calling this function load doc. The function requests data from the web server and displays it. So this load doc is going to get data from the web server and displays it. So here, this is the load doc. We have our constant x HTTP equal new XML HTTP request. So this is a special method that allows us to access that server. And then on load, meaning once you get the data from the server, the function, you're going to get the response text. So you see this dot response text. So you're going to get something back when you load this. Right? So dot open, X state should be open. So this here is where you're getting the information from. Get name of the file and true. And then you're going to send. All right, so what is AJAX? AJAX is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. AJAX is not a programming language. AJAX just uses a combination of a browser, built-in XML HTTP request object, which is used to request data from the web server. So this is a special built-in object that you have access to. JavaScript and HTML DOM to display the user or use the data. So it's a combination of the XHTML object, and it's also a combination of JavaScript and the HTML DOM. So when we speak about the HTML DOM, it means the document object model. So every web page has their own DOM, so we're able to access data and actually place data onto our client side or front end, our UI. So AJAX is a misleading name. AJAX application might use XML to transport data, but it is equally common to transport data as plain text or JSON. So the name has an XML, but it is not really using that, right? It's using JSON. So AJAX allows web pages to be updated asynchronously by exchanging data with the web server behind the scenes. Right? So we are able to do this asynchronously. Right. So how does it work? Okay, so your browser, an event occurs, something happens, it could be a click of a button, and then you create an XHTML request object, and then you send the HTTP request. Right, so remember when you're talking about these requests, it means, let's say you click a button and it goes to another page, or it calls a function. All right, so those are the HTTP requests. So it goes over the internet, it goes to the server processes the HTTP request, it creates a response and sends the data back to the browser. So then it goes again, it travels over the internet again, and then it comes back out, and then the browser will process the return data using JavaScript and will update the page content. So if you wanted to get some information, what will happen is when it reaches here, it will process the data that is returned from this response here, and then it will put it on your browser. So an event occurs in a web page, right? This is what would trigger our AJAX, right? An event occurs in the web page, the page is loaded, a button is clicked. An XHTML request object is created by JavaScript. The XML HTTP request object sends a request to our web server. The server processes the request. All right, so this is the step. These are the steps. So an event happens. So when they speak about event, an event occurs, an event occurs in our web. Then number two, the XHTML object is created by JavaScript. So they create that. Then the XML HTTP request object sends a request to the web server. So it says, hey, I need so-and-so, so-and-so. the server processes the request, say, okay, let me get it for you. The server then sends a response back to the web page. Right, so this is the second phase. It sends it back to the web page, and the response is read by JavaScript. Sorry. So the response is read by JavaScript, and then the proper action, like a page update, is performed by JavaScript. So modern browsers can use Fetch API instead of XML HTTP request objects. The Fetch API interface allows your web browser to make HTTP requests to your web servers. So if you use the XML HTTP request object, Fetch can do the same thing in a simpler way. Right? So you can use it, or you could use Fetch. Let's see. What is this XML HTTP request object? So this is the keystone of Ajax. It is able to create a XML HTTP request object. You can define a callback function. You could open a XML HTTP request object, and then you could send a request to the server. So you could create, define a callback, open a request, an object, and then you could send it. So all modern browsers support the XML, right? Object, all of them. And the object can be used to exchange data with a web server behind the scenes. This means that it is possible to update parts of a web page without reloading the whole page. So things could be happening in the background, and you don't have to reload the entire page. All right, when you say reloading, it means you have to go through the whole CSS parsing, meaning that you have to take the page, interpret all the code, possibly get some JavaScript, right? So that's what the reload does. It does all the work over. So if you can use this and not have to do all of that, because that's the real, if you have all these things already set, you don't necessarily need to reload it, right? You don't need to reinterpret it, let's say, right? Okay, so you can create an HTTP request object. So all modern browsers have a built-in XML HTTP request object. So the syntax of doing that is simply say new X HTML request. You can define a callback function. So the callback function is a function passed as a parameter to another function. In this case, the callback function should contain the code to execute when the response is ready. So when the response is ready, so the callback function will contain the code that needs to be executed. All right, so that's why I say X HTTP. Right, so we have a variable here. You create a new object. You assign it to this value here and unload. Right, you will then have a function. So send request, to send a request to a server, you can use the open and send methods. So if I say open get Ajax info.text, so I want to get this here, and then I want to send it. So here we're going to create a XML HTTP request object. We're going to define a callback function, and then we're going to send the request. So we want to get some data from this here as a request. And then we're going to send it. So open it and then send it, right? So again, inside here will contain this text. All right, so across domains, for security reasons, in modern browsers not allow access across domains. So it means that both the web page and the XML server file it tries to load must be located on the same server. So the examples of W3 Schools all open XML files located in the W3 Schools domain. So if you want to use the example above on one of your own web pages, the XML files you load must be located on your own server. All right, so here are some of the methods. Here's the object, cancels the request, returns the header, etc. Open specifies the request method. The request type, get or post, and we know the difference between get and post. One is more secure. One is your data might be available on the bar. This bar here when you send it. URL is the file location. Async true, asynchronous or false synchronous. Right, so you want to put the async true. Then you can have an optional username and then an optional password. Send the request to the server, use for get request, and then send with a string, send the request to the server, use for post request. That's just a little different. And then you're going to set request header as a label value PHP header to be sent. I don't see these are some of the properties. So it's an object and it has some properties, right? So these are the methods you could use, and this is the property. Every object has properties and methods, right? Or attributes and behavior. So on load, it defines a function to be called when the request is received or loaded, right? So once the server receives the request, that's what the onload does. On ready state change defines a function to be called when the ready state property changes. Ready state, it holds the status of the XML HTTP request. 0, request is not initialized, right? 1, the server connection is established. 2, the request was received. 3, the processing the request. And 4, request finished and response is ready. All right, so just keep thinking about this is just an exchange. You go, you're asking for something, you're waiting for the server, you need to have a connection. And they need to get a request. When they get a request, they need to do something, perform some processing on it. When they get the processing, then they will have the response ready. Response text returns the response data as a string, right? So response text gets the response data as a string. So that's why we saw that when we get it as a string, we can then convert it to a JavaScript object. Response XML returns it as an XML data. So we know that we have 2 formats in which to receive our data, JSON or XML. So remember, when we get it as a string, that's how JSON goes over to the web server. We could simply use our methods, our JSON method to JSON.parse to bring it into a JavaScript object. Once we have that, we can extract our data. And then you have some status. It returns a number of requests, 200 okay, 43 forbidden, 44 not. Right, so for complete, you could go to the references and you could see all of the different error messages. All right. All right, so now we're looking at the onload property and the 3 main ones. So onload, the object with the XML HTTP request object you can define a callback function to be executed when the request receives an answer. The function is defined in the onload property of the XML HTTP request. So the function is defined in the onload property. So with that, the object, you can define a callback. You can define a callback function to be executed when the request receives an answer. All right, so that onload would tell us, okay, once we get an answer, what do you want to happen? So this function, once I get back a response from the server, this is what I want to do. Right? So open get, you're going to read data from ajax.info text and then xhttp.send, right? So remember what the send does, it sends a request to the server using the get. Right? So the server, this is here sending the request. So our request here is sent to the server. So we have our file. We want them to get something from the file. And the server is then going to send us a response text. Right. And whatever we ask for, you're going to get. Right, so you're going to get some data. If you have multiple callback functions, right? If you have more than one AJAX task in a website, you should create one function for executing the HTTP request object and one callback function for each AJAX task. So the function should contain a URL on what function to call when the response is ready. Let's say I have these two documents, function 1. So when you load URL 1, you're calling function 1. When you load URL 2, you're calling function 2. All right, so function load doc URL, and then you have a function unload. Then they pass in the function, they see that function, so it will go here and pick up whichever function you have to load. Right, the ready state property holds the status of the XML HTTP request, and the on ready state change property defines a callback function to be executed when the ready state changes. The status property and the status text properties hold the status of the XML HTTP request object. Again, you have the ready state defines a function, you have the ready request and ready status. So on ready state change function is called every time the ready state changes. And when the ready state is 4 and the status is 200, the response is ready. All right, so when the ready state is 4, meaning okay, the request has been finished and the response is ready. And the status is okay, nothing happened, meaning you got a positive result and it didn't get something, didn't happen to the server, etc., based on these codes. Right, so each code here would be different. So you have 1, 2 is successful. So you have 200, 201, all these are codes that are available. They have 3 redirection. All right, so let's say you request something and it has moved to a different URL. That's what's going to come up. And then you have the client error, which is the 400 bad requests. Let's say something around the syntax, 401 unauthorized, 402 payment required, forbidden. The request is legal, but the server is refusing to respond, not found if they didn't find it, right? So these are the different responses. And then you have also 5, internal server error, etc. So when you see 200, it means okay. So here, this is why they're checking to see if it's 4 and if the status is 200. Right? So we know that we'll be okay once we are 4, meaning request was finished and your response is ready. Because remember, even if you send your request, it could still be processing. Right? So you don't want to do anything with it being processed. You want to get the data. You want to start moving or dealing with whatever request you send once you have gotten it. Once the server responds to you and let's say response to this and complete the request, and once your status is okay, you're gonna get the response.txt. Right? Again, the response.txt. This is a method, a property inside of this object. So we now will get the response as a string, right? So that's what response text is. So you send a request to this web server, and then you're going to get a response. The onReady state change event is triggered 4 times, 1 time for each change in the state. All right, so this is the request. Right, to send a request is used to request data from the server, right? So we know that this object does that. And to send a request to a server, you can use open and send methods. of that object. So when you open it here, you could specify the type of request, the method, whether it's a get or post, the URL or the server, the file, the location. Then you're going to say if it's a sync true, asynchronous, or false. Send the request to the server used by get, and send with a string, it sends it with send to the server using a post. So the URL pattern of the open method is an address to a file on a server. So here, this here is an address to a file on the server. So here using an ASP file, you could use a JSON as we saw before, or use a text. I remember we have JSON files as well. So any file here, or it could even be a location or API, right? So a URL. So asynchronous true or false, server request should be sent asynchronously. The async parameter of the open method should be set to true. So by sending asynchronously, the JavaScript does not have to wait for the server response, right? But can instead execute other scripts while waiting for the server response and deal with the response after the response is ready, right? So putting it to true means that, okay, I'm not waiting until everything is done, because you don't really want to have a web page and everything stops because you ask the server for some information, right? Their users would leave. So the default value for the async is true. So you can safely remove it, right? So this true value is not necessary. If it is not there, it is true. Right, get or post. So get is simpler and faster than post and can be used in most cases. However, always use post requests when a cache file is not an option of data file or database on the server. Sending a large amount of data to the server, post has no size limitation, and sending user input, which can contain unknown characters. Post is more robust and secure than get. Right, so a simple get here, we simply say get data from this ASP file. Right, so you say get that. In the above example, you may get a cache result. To avoid this, you add a unique ID to the URL. So when you say cache result, it means that's something that was done already. So it is saved on a cache. All right, so you want to say something here like a right. So you can use this here. Mat.random just simply gets a random that's not much. So see here. Right, so if you're sending this, it will be a unique request. That's what that does. If you want to send information with the get method, add the information to the URL. So here, you can add the information to the URL. So I am saying I want to get first name Henry and last name Ford. Hello, Henry Ford. Get Henry Ford. Right, I don't know what is in the ASP file. How the server uses the input and how the server responds to requests is explained later on. All right, so if you want to do post, so you could use post when you have lots of data, right? Let me just go back to it. When a cache file is not an option, when you have a large amount of data, when you want to send user input, which can contain unknown characters. So the post data, like an HTML form, add the HTTP header with the set request header. It specifies the data you want to send in the send method. So example here, you have post ajax.asp. You could send a request header And then you could send here F name Henry, first name Ford. So you're sending it through here. Before in the get, we just simply send it in the URL because that's what get does. Get actually puts the values in your URL. All right, so the send request header, it adds the HTTP headers to the request, it specifies the header name, and it specifies the header value. Synchronous request, to execute a synchronous request, you have to just put this here as false. Okay, change the third parameter in the open method to false, right? So we knew that if it's true, it is asynchronous. So sometimes async false are used for quick testing. So you'll find synchronous requests in older JavaScript code. Since the code will wait for the server completion, there is no need for an onReady state function. So here we're not waiting, so we don't need to use the onReady or onload equal because we're not waiting. We're waiting. We're not waiting, and everything will only happen when, because I have this false here, only when all the data is ready. Right, so it's not recommended. All right, so just know that. So that's a request, and then you get a response. So keep thinking. I need to get data from the server. It has to go to the server as a string. It could be a JavaScript object, but it's going to come back as a JSON, which is the easiest format. And that's all we're talking about. Talking to the server, sending a request, getting a response, and then dealing with that or send it back to the client. Right, so a response property, you could say response text, which gets it as a string, and they have the XML. Right, so the text returns the server response as a JavaScript string, and you can use it accordingly. So when you get a response, it will come back as a string, and then you could do whatever you want to do. Right, so the XML property, again, has a built-in XML parser. The response XML property returns the server response as an XML DOM object. And using the property, you can pass the response as an XML DOM object. Right, so don't worry about that because we're not using any XML. Server response, so methods, you can get response header. It returns specific header information from the server resource. And then it could add get all response header returns a header information from the service web. So this one is a specific, if you say get response header, and then get all response headers. So get all response headers, return the header information for the server response. Right, let's see what it is, right? So this is all of the information that you're going to get with the header. So you're going to get that, you're going to get cache control, all these are headers that will go along with your message. Right. Get response header. Here, you notice you are specifying one particular header one, which is the last modifier. When you say get all, it got all of them, all. And here you're specifying the one with the header alone, you're specifying one. So now we will only get one. Right, so sometimes you will need to say, in this case, when was this data last modified? And obviously that data will be stored in our header, so we can access it. All right, I'm not doing XML PHP, I'm not doing XML ASP, I'm not doing database. Fly. All right, so basically that is what the Ajax is about. You could go ahead and you'll read it over again. And on the eClassroom, all right, so this is the second, this is what we're doing here. All right, and I have a little note. So this is a kind of This is what you need to focus on. You need to understand what JavaScript is, how to work with it, what is AJAX, how it's used to fetch your data, and AJAX with promises. So I want you all to read this, go through it again now, right? See if you understand it. Make sure you understand all different things, how you work with the objects, how you pass the objects. So here you do have the, right, using the JSON.pass, which we went through extensively on W3 Schools. So if you don't understand the symbol, you could go on W3 Schools and get it. Right, so here it gave us JSON strings into JavaScript objects, right? How we know is a JSON string again, you're going to notice the quotes. Then you could stringify it, meaning you're converting the JavaScript objects into JSON strings. Why would you do that? Because strings are the only thing that should be sent across to the server. All right, and then I have little exercises for you. So go over it one at a time and just do the exercises. Read it. If you need more and you don't understand, you could access your W3 Schools or the internet to get more information. All right, so you have 3 exercises here. These are the exercises I want you to do, and I'll give you a 5%, right? Okay, ladies. The ladies in class today, 2 ladies, right?
Yes, miss.
All right. All right, so you're gonna continue your assignment 1. If you get it done, then you're going to work on this. Right, this is the 5%, and then we will move on from there. All right, so next week we're supposed to start doing some more plugins with jQuery. All right, so I'll see you all next week. Please God. All right.
Again, miss. Bye.
Okay. All right. Bye. Bye, Chantal.